So Monday morning, April 6th, good morning to you all. Back in the classroom, broken again. And today what I think I'd like to do is walk and talk our way through a couple of stories. I think what I'm going to do is, my goal here is to post short videos, try to keep them 10 to 12 minutes long, and cover a couple of the chapters, a couple of the stories that are in the things they carried, kind of sequentially work our way through. So I'm going to throw a bunch of stuff up. Hopefully this afternoon, tomorrow, and then and I'm also going to post an assignment of some sort. So try to keep things moving. You know, it's weird. I never thought. I think I always said that teaching was kind of what made teaching really work for me, was that it was a two-way street, right? But I never realized how much my teaching relied on students, which is kind of both ironic and sort of really simple and plain to see, if you think about it. So it's weird to try to make these things and put them out there, or to do this. And I don't know, maybe I should be doing Zoom meetings with you guys and Google Hangouts and that kind of stuff. And to that end, maybe on Wednesday or Thursday afternoon, I'll post it on the website. We can arrange to have some sort of, again, meet and greet. Only this time what I'd like to do is have a meet and greet where we very deliberately talk about the book. It's not a just kind of casual drop in, but for people interested in having a conversation about the things they carried, we can do that. So that's the plan. So let's get us some stuff to talk about. So I'm gonna start this morning with spin. I'm gonna cover in this video, hopefully, spin and Rainy River. And so let's see what happens. So we got the right book this time, right pagination. So let's go to page 30 where spin starts. Spin, of course, I think he very much titles it that way because he's talking about not the actual event itself, but it's the same kind of usage that journalists have today, right? You put spin on a story. You put spin on, you come home after your parents told you you're supposed to be home, and you've dented the car, and you need to figure out some sort of story that you can tell the parents that's not quite a lie, but to do it in a certain way that will help alleviate the wrath that you're fearful of. That's called putting a spin on the story. You do it all the time. You've done it countless times with me, I'm sure, right? A certain kind of spin about why your work is late, and whatever. So just want you to know, I'm tired of it, Bowers. I'm tired of that late work. All right. So on page 30, though, he's talking about spin, and he's talking about the ways in which, again, what it gets to in this book, and why I think his book becomes a book that is, in a sense, a textbook of postmodernism to an extent, is the notion of spin directly challenges the notion of truth, or challenges the idea that truth is really plain to see, right? I mean, if you can tell the truth, but in such a way to get a certain kind of reaction or a certain kind of, outcome, then, or what you're dealing with really truth in that sense. So it's again, O'Brien, the author, is addressing the ways in which we craft truth, I think, both in the stories and what he makes plain, I think, in this chapter and the next one, is the way in which we spin stories even to ourselves, which would connect, of course, with that idea about identity. If we tell ourselves a certain kind of way that we are, and we keep telling ourselves that story over and over again with that same kind of spin, then our identity becomes that thing, right? And it feels natural. So spin. What I'd like to draw your attention to are a couple of things. One is, the very first little paragraph, the little incident where they see the kid with one leg, with the plastic leg hopping around and saying GI number 1, and Azar gives the kid a bunch of chocolate, and then the kid hops away. And Azar says, some poor guy ran out of ammo. Meaning, of course, the suggestion is, where he says war's a bitch, some poor guy ran out of ammo. The suggestion being, like, had that guy had one more shot, instead of just shooting off one leg, the guy would have actually killed the kid. Right? And that way, the kid, in a sense, would have been better, as it is the kid is suffering. And there's a kind of I mean, it's just such a weird way to think about life and reality and that kind of thing. But it's this idea, and of course, O'Brien, the narrator, frames it as a, as this is a sweet little story. Sometimes things could almost get sweet. So here's this really nice gesture to give the kid a bunch of chocolate. The kid hops away all happy, right? But then Azar's take on it is the kid's, it's really, in a sense, a tragedy of sorts. And as well as then, of course, I'm assuming between O'Brien, the character, and Azar, a kind of joke at that time, right? The way it kind of like a little dark gallows humor. So it's never, events and things rely on the way they are told, which of course is one of the core arguments of postmodernism, right? That the truth is not in the thing itself. The truth is in the language that we use, the interpretation that we give that thing, so then we can say it's sweet, it's tragic, it's a poem, it's a list, right? This again goes straight back to Stanley Fish. I like on page 31, the little paragraph, I'm 43 years old now, and 43 years old and a writer now. That kind of self-referential aspect of it again, where the narrator is referencing himself, and of course making it really problematic because, again, is this Tim O'Brien author, Tim O'Brien a character talking? If you're going to call it a work of fiction, I don't know how it's Tim O'Brien the author. I mean, you can't, I mean, do you have partial fiction and partial nonfiction? What does that mean? Does that mean that there are partial truths? Things are only true half the time? So you're either all fiction or all nonfiction. To an well, we'll see. So the other thing I want to point out in that little paragraph, right, is the way that he says, I sit at a typewriter and stare through my words and watch Kiowa sinking in the deep muck of the shit field, or Kurt Lemon hanging in pieces from a tree. And as I write about these things, the remembering is turned into a kind of rehappening, right? So we get a couple of incidents. We don't know anything about Kiowa sinking into into the deep muck of a shit field yet, right? And we haven't gotten the full story on Kurt Lemon being killed, right, and blown up into a tree. So there's this kind of non-linearity that permeates this novel as well, which would be another hallmark of postmodern fiction, just non-linear telling, non-linear, right? Because again, in what order do things happen? Things happen in one order, but the way that we talk about them maybe isn't, or write about them is in a different order. So postmodern, one of the hallmarks of postmodernism is to challenge the idea that there's a linear progressive narrative. And we'll see that especially when we get to the Thomas Kuhn essays in the TOK Reader, The Route to Normal Science. So there is that going on for us. Also, these kind of little fragments, right? Especially this chapter with each little paragraph like its own little mini story. This kind of fragmentation, a hallmark of modernism, but in a modernist guise, the answer would always be that the artist or the poet in some way, shape, or form was going to make the connections for you. Here, there's no, right? There are no connections. It doesn't ultimately build onto something. They're just little chunklets of story. Page 33. I feel guilty sometimes. 43 years old, I'm still writing war stories. My daughter Kathleen tells me it's an obsession. I should write about a little girl who finds $1 million and spends it all on a Shelton pony. So here's the narrator talking about his children. But Tim O'Brien, when he writes, right, Tim O'Brien does, turns out, have a daughter, but he had her much later than this book. When he wrote this novel, he only had 2 sons. So, again, this kind of questioning or challenging this idea of what's true, what's not true, what we can rely on is very much happening there. Same paragraph. You take your material where you find it, which is in your life, at the intersection of past and present. The memory traffic feeds into a rotary up in your head where it goes in circles for a while. Then pretty soon imagination flows in and traffic merges and shoots off down 1,000 different streets. The character, Tim O'Brien character, describing for us the work of an author, right? The way that there's the event that happened, there's the memory of it, which gets burdened or overlaid or runs up against imagination, which is going to change things and fragmented, and it goes down all these different sort of venues or ways of telling that are going to make it, of course, maybe make it interesting to read and maybe make it emotional or you know, in that sense, but doesn't necessarily make it true. And all the ways that you tell these stories, you know, aren't going to wind up being truth. So, you know, and of course, here's a character telling us how writers operate. But can we automatically assume that that's how writers, in fact, do the things that they do? Is a character in a novel. If a character in a novel tells you how to, you know, perform surgery, you don't like go find a kitchen knife and practice. You know, just because a character says it doesn't make it truth. So we have to ask certain questions about that as well, and challenge both what's being told, you know, maybe go out and try to verify it, interview other writers and see if this is really how they operate. So, you know, questions of trust, questions of reality when it comes to fictional characters. So really quickly in this little chapter on spin, you know, we get, you know, the idea that fiction in some way can equal truth, and there's some sort of vehicle or some sort of framing of it that we can achieve truth through fiction is challenged, right? Which, and again, this kind of this location of truth very much a hallmark of postmodernism. Postmodernism is very much asking the question and challenging this idea, you know, that it's well, in a certain way, maybe it's the end result of that long slog that we had from Plato all the way through the Enlightenment, through modernism. That, you know, even in the modernist times, if we got rid of God and we got rid of, you know, institutions, there was a sort of an argument that the artist was in some way, shape, or form going to save us, right? Or that you could save yourself. But now we can't even write who is the self that's talking. Is it Tim O'Brien, the character, Tim O'Brien, the author? And when we tell ourselves stories about memory, you know, that we remember, how powerful is the language that is shaping the story we're telling ourselves? So questions of reality or fictionality and truth and reality are hallmarks of postmodernism. The other hallmark of postmodernism is one I've been, you know, arguing all year long, and that is, what's the role of language in truth, in story, in value, the way that we shape the things that how we think, how we feel about things, how we understand things, right? It's being done through language, and because of that, then it shapes the very thing itself. And I think O'Brien, the author, stylistically, is wrestling that out, especially in a chapter like Spin. You get these short little vignettes that don't really connect. Some of them point to or discuss things that we haven't read about yet. You know, some of them are self-referential. We get, you know, we get it. We get the access to what the meaning is, to what reality is highly problematic. If you go on page 34, that middle paragraph, I remember Mitchell Saunders smiling as he told me that story. Most of it he made up, I'm sure, but even so, it gave me a quick truth goose because it's all relative, right? All relative, ultimately. The way in which it's couched, the way in which it's framed is all sort of, well, it cannot be ultimately pinned down in some sort of really prescriptivist way where you can say this is that. We can try that and we can aim for that, but it doesn't happen. And that's Azar's defense, right? After he blows up Ted Lavender's puppy, that's Azar's defense, is a kind of relativity, and he wants a certain sort of pass, right, in this case, because he's spinning the story about what he did to that little puppy based on the fact that he's young, right? He says, I'm just a boy, right? You know, is his logic for that. So he's spinning it. The other thing about that little incident, we'll see O'Brien, the author, do this a couple of times, is that there are going to be these moments where really horrible things are told, you know, and if you, the little episode with the puppy, the actual telling of the episode of the puppy is one sentence and very matter of fact, very plain, but the emotional effect of that, and this is where I think O'Brien, the author, is a real genius in a way, right, as he understands that there's a certain kind of emotionality that can be achieved by stripping it down, right? There's just very few sort of adverbs or adjectives in that little one sentence telling of that story on page 35 about what happens to the puppy, right? You get no sort of value-laden phraseology. It's just, here's what happened, and but it's just horrible, right? I mean, it's just tragic. So, you know, so O'Brien, the author, understands the power of language and the power of being able to tell things in a way that are going to be very moving. Doesn't necessarily make them, in a sense, a realistically way truthful, but perhaps the suggestion is the emotional truth is deeper than the real truth, right? The actual just recounting or telling of events. So we're going to close this one. We're not going to get to Rainy River in this little episode. We're going to close this little short with page 36. That very last section, right, where O'Brien, the character, comes back again, 43 years old, and the war occurred half a lifetime ago, and yet the remembering makes it now. And sometimes remembering will lead to a story which makes it forever. That's what stories are for. Stories are for joining the past to the future, which I think that's a really powerful sort of summation of what he's about in this novel, that kind of linking of past to future. You read a story in the present, it's about the Vietnam War, something that took place in the past. And English teachers and perhaps authors and many people, book reviewers, will tell you, though, that something about reading the story can help you as you go forward into your future life, right? And so that's why we read things, because they help us see through and understand emotions and events and effects. They may not give us the truth, but they give us perhaps even something lower or deeper than truth, right? An emotional way to sort of frame our life, our existence, and how we move through the world. And that's, I think, what good writing is, one of the things good writing can be for. So we come to the end of Spin, and I'll make the end of this little video because I don't want to go on too long. So we're going to end here, and then I'll post another one we'll cover on Rainy River. Thanks.